Hi. Hi. My name is Ethan Tapper, and I'm here to talk to you about this cool new adventure that I'm on right now, which is that I wrote a dang book. It's right there. Called How to Love a Forest. And I'm going to do some readings from it and just talk to you about what it's all about. It's been cool. So I'm up in Maine for basically this whole week. We were saying from yesterday through next Tuesday. Just talking in all these cool parts of the state, a lot of which I've never been to before, but Maine has a lot in common with Vermont. We're both forest strong, right? And strong traditional working with the land and living among forests. That's what I look like. So this is my cue. Basically, most of these slides up here are for me, to remind me where I'm at in this presentation, so don't even worry about those. My name's Ethan Tapper. I am mostly a forester from Vermont. My journey was I went to the University of Vermont. Actually, when I was a kid growing up, I wasn't like a nature kid or anything like that. I just grew up in a rural part of Vermont. I was surrounded by forests, but I had no idea that that's what I wanted to do. And that's what I wanted to make my life. And then through a series of like misadventures and weird things happening to me, I ended up on this like 6-month wilderness expedition in the woods of Vermont, where we skied north for 3 months, and we built a canoe and we canoed back down. And when I tell you that I didn't know I was doing that until 2 weeks before it happened, that is the honest truth. And so I ended up on this thing, and when I came back, I just wanted to be in the woods all the time. And I remember I had a scholarship to the University of Vermont that I put on hold to go on that expedition, and then I was off. I worked as a wilderness guide. I did a little bit of work with draft horses, apprenticing with a draft horse logger. And after about a year and a half, the University of Vermont sent me a letter, and they said, if you don't come back, you're going to lose your scholarship. So I got to go back. And I remember looking at a paper list of all the different majors, all the different things that I could study. And I picked forestry because it had the word forest in it. I did not know what it was at all. And I was like, it's got the word forest in it, must be pretty good. And I ended up going to school for forestry. I then worked, I still worked a little bit as a wilderness guide, still did a little bit of like the draft horse stuff. But then I worked as a forest technician on some like pretty industrial timberlands in the Adirondacks, and then went to work for a consulting forestry company out of Montpelier, Vermont, our state's capital. And then got a job as the Chittenden County Forester, which is a service forester. So you work for the state, and you're just a public resource. You know, you advise people about how to care for their land. You take care of some small-scale public lands, town forests, and you manage this program. You all have a similar program called the Current Use Program, right, where people have a forest management plan that's developed by a forester, and they agree to follow it. In exchange, they get like a tax break. Manage that program, and then one thing sort of led to another, and I started writing this book. And it sort of happened kind of magically, really, because I didn't really know that I was writing a book for a long time. I just was really sensing this just real misunderstandings among the people that I worked with and the people in the public about how forests work and what it means to care for them. And this really what it was that I was seeing was this dichotomy where a lot of people think, I think, that if you care about forests, if you care about ecosystems, if you care about wildlife, biodiversity, that you leave all that stuff alone. And you just like put it over here and you stay away. And the people who are doing stuff, who are managing forests, who are caring for them, who are doing things like cutting trees, must be people who don't care, right? And that experience, like that sentiment was so wrong in my eyes that I was like, there's not a book out here that tells me that. And so I just started to write. I figured out that the time when my brain works the best for writing is the first hour that I'm awake in the day, 5 to 6 a.m. And I just started to write for an hour every day. And I think it was really 2 years before I allowed myself to believe that I was actually writing a book. And the whole process took 6 years. And it was just a pretty magical thing, because it's like every day you just sit down there and you don't, you're not trying to like write a book today. You're just trying to write for 1 hour. And then you do that again and again and again every day for 6 years, and you end up with this thing. And it was kind of cool too. Like I'd never written a book before. This was my first book. And I feel like a lot of it, throughout this process, I was teaching myself how to write this book. And I was teaching myself how to write the book that I believed that the world needed for me in this moment. And it just transformed into something that, it's not a cookbook about like, this is how you manage this forest in this way. It's a book about how do we like reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and what it means to care for them. And I think really more in the tradition of a book like Sand County Almanac by Alda Leopold, or Braiding Sweetgrass, one of these books that's really about the land ethic. What is our relationship with ecosystems? And I want to read to you from the book's introduction about sort of that feeling that I had when I started to write the book. Once it seemed that there were only 2 paths to follow. A status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I've realized that neither of these 2 paths is enough. I've realized that this world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, depth infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest. Engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, which is my land, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In these books, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this changed and changing world. It is a new land ethic, a vision of relationship and responsibility, freedom and power, resilience and humility, legacy, beauty, and change. Themes that define my life and my work, and that became the basis for this book's chapters. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent, this is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. So it's more than just like, we love forests and we leave them alone. We don't care about forests and we do stuff to them. What I was really experiencing was being in really a pretty deep relationship with these ecosystems and being like, these things need help. And more and more it seemed like the people who are just like, let nature take its course and leave it all alone were being negligent. When I saw that there was so much good that could be done to care for these ecosystems, which are also, by the way, like not just important in and of themselves, they're important to us. We need them. We can't live without them, physically. And if we let them be degraded and impaired, we're not going to be okay. So the way that I start this, this book, and the way that I start a lot of times when I talk about forests is just like sort of the invitation to reimagine what forests are. Because this may surprise you. Maybe all of you think that you know exactly what a forest is. Maybe you do. But most people have absolutely no idea, which is weird because, like, I'm from Vermont, 75% forested. Maine's like, what, 80% forested. And everybody's like, yeah, I know a forest when I go into it because there's a bunch of trees there, right? The tip of the iceberg. And if we're going to reimagine what it means to care for these ecosystems, we also need to reimagine what they are. So here's what most people think a forest is. This is also, I should say, a forest that is deeply impaired by deer browse. Mm-hmm. If, like, anybody who walks in this forest is like, oh, beautiful. It's just what we want to see. And yet, when I look in the forest, I'm like, something's wrong. Something's missing. There's so much emptiness here. So a forest is more than just a place with a bunch of trees. This is my favorite definition that I think approaches what a forest actually is. This is a definition of what we call a natural community. And it's from this book, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. And it says that natural communities are, quote, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. And that's so much of a better way of understanding what these ecosystems really are, because they're not just the trees. They're the trees and the plants and the animals and the fungi and the soils and even the natural disturbances that may kill trees. And they're the animals and they're the insects and they're all of those things. And really, when I take care of forests and when I think about what it means to protect a forest, I'm not trying to protect just those trees. You can't, because all of those organisms are performing really vital functions for pollination, for seed dispersal, for building soils, all of these different things that fundamentally support the ability of those trees to live. So when I talk about taking care of the forest, I'm not talking about the trees, I'm talking about all the stuff. I think the best way to describe the way that I think about what a forest is it's like a coral reef. And the trees are like the coral. So they're this living structure around which this community is built, right? And you can't have a coral reef without coral. We all know this. But if we were all thinking about what a coral reef is, we would never be like, it's a place with a bunch of coral. Or we would never be picturing it as like a bunch of coral and nothing else. We would be picturing this whole web of life that's woven around it. And when you really spend a lot of time with forests and other ecosystems, you see that they're all like that. And I have a reading for that too, I think. I do. So I spend the first chapter is called Reimagining, and it's about me working in my orchard and sort of like juxtaposing this orchard with like what a forest really is. A group of chickadees visits me, flitting from fence to fence. I pause to watch their circus. As my pruning shears quiet, I hear nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos, the pounding of a pileated woodpecker on an aspen. As I've learned to recognize more of the forest birds, a cacophony has become a chorus. Each species of bird calls its own name. Each touches the forest in different ways, each providing habitat within different pieces and parts of this living community. Each is unique. A decade ago, I looked into the forest and saw faceless trees, each like the others. As I've learned to tell sugar maple from red maple, the flat needles of hemlock from the angular needles of spruce, the peeling bark of paper birch from the creamy bark of aspen, the forest has become a creature of diversity and complexity and depth. Each tree species is habitat for different birds, insects, and mammals, each growing on different sites and in different ways, each flourishing different flowers and bearing different fruits. Each is precious. Once I saw a forest as no different from orchards. I have since learned to reimagine the forest as something messy and imperfect, complex and indefinable, dynamic and expansive over space and time. I have learned to see the trees in the forest as the coral in a coral reef, the living structure at the center of a community of boundless depth and diversity. I have learned that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. It's something we need to develop. I have learned that forests are not supposed to be pleasant or understandable or beautiful to us. They are what they are, and it's up to us to meet them there. Now when I look into the forest, I see kaleidoscopes of interactions and connections, critical pieces and parts as diminutive as a bed of moss on a rotting log, and as massive as a mountain, a region, a continent, a biosphere. Now I see that the fungi and the bacteria of the soil, the insects, the mosses and the lichens, the beech and the oak, the deer and the owls and the bears, these things do not live in the forest. They are the forest. The windstorms and the ice storms, the forest fires and the floods, the death and the change, these things do not happen to the forest. They are the forest. Once I thought that being a forester meant being the caretaker of trees. Now I see myself as the caretaker of a reimagined forest, the steward of every piece of this incredible volume of life. So, I mentioned something in there. I want to skip over this guy and look at this, because I mentioned something in there about an understanding of healthy forests is not something that any of us are born with. It's something we need to develop. It's just an interesting thing that happens when you work as a forester. I walked in the woods with more than 1,000 people, and how consistently people have the same vision for what a healthy forest looks like. That. Or like that picture we were looking at before. It's got to be evenly spaced big trees, nothing growing in the understory, and every time we walk into a forest like that, which really, it's like what a park looks like, everybody goes, yes, this is what it's supposed to be. And a lot of people, you know, they manage their forest to look like that. It's very instinctive for us. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for why that is. There's some scientists have suggested that maybe an evolutionary bias. But for whatever reason, we just come prepackaged for, you know, with this vision of like, that's what a healthy forest looks like. Unfortunately, that's almost the opposite of what a healthy forest looks like. The way the forests have looked on this landscape for thousands of years is more like that. They are messy, which in ecological terms we would refer to as complexity. They have some big trees, but they also are equally defined by trees of all different sizes and ages, by deadwood on the ground, by gaps in the forest canopy, by dead standing trees, by all of these different things. And so it's this interesting journey that we all get to take, and that we have to take if we're going to take care of forests, where we have to sort of go against our instincts on this stuff. Because ecologically, this is a desert. And this is incredibly vibrant and beautiful and important. And when I manage forests, I'm not trying to manage them to look like that. I'm trying to manage them to look like that. Because this is actually the conditions that our forests have looked like this for thousands of years. And which means that also, all of these natural processes that sustain them, all of our native biodiversity, these are the conditions that they're adapted to. They're adapted to forests that are multi-generational, that have trees of all different sizes and ages. They're adapted to forests that have big gaps in the canopy. They're adapted to forests that have some big trees, but not a lot. They're adapted to forests that have tons of dead wood on the ground. And as a result of our landscape history, the way we've managed forests in the past, and especially like agricultural clearing, which is something that really defines like most of New England, not far northern Maine, but a lot of Maine as well, our forests don't have any of that stuff. That they are super young, and we're going to talk about that in a second. I just want to go back to this picture of this beautiful yellow warbler. I love birds. I actually got into birds because I do all this forest management, like working with loggers or cutting down trees and stuff, and it's very confusing to people, and found that if you explain the value of this work that we're doing in terms of birds, it helps people understand it in a different way. Because it's like, who could ever think that to cut down a tree could be something that's positive for a forest, but maybe people are interested in why, forest songbirds are in decline. And, how they're not seeing certain species of birds that are associated with some of these conditions that we can do forest management for. So then, just as I think happens to all of us when we reach a certain age, I just got into birds on accident, and now I just love them. But anyway, so that's all to say. Biodiversity, this is also an important word for us to know. Biodiversity, it's a contraction of the words biological diversity, and my definition comes from the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. Heard of him? Super special guy. He's the one who got me really excited about biodiversity. He's a myrmecologist, M-Y-R, myrmecologist. He studies ants. And he's also written all of these like really important books. He calls insects the little things that run the world. Because insects are like, they account for like 97% of all the species on Earth. There's all these weird facts, like there's like 300 pounds of insect biomass for every pound of human biomass on the planet. Our total biomass as humans is equal to about what spiders eat in a year, or to the biomass of just the ants. So anyway, that's all aside, an aside to say this biodiversity is defined by that guy, E.O. Wilson, as the variation between species within an ecosystem. So like this is how most of us think about it. Like how many species are in a forest? How many species of birds? How many species of plants? Whatever. The variation between ecosystems across our landscape. So some ecosystems support some species, some ecosystems support other species. And we need to have sort of that landscape level diversity as well. That's also part of biodiversity. And the third part of it is the variation between the genetics within an individual species. So you might have different populations of species that have different genes. Those genes are actually really important as those species deal with different stressors. So biodiversity, I think that when we think about it, a lot of us, again, think of it as something that's like, cool, it's nice to have a bird. You know, how nice. Lucky us. Cool, pretty thing to see. But again, with this more expansive definition of what forests are, you start to realize that like actually this system can't function without that biodiversity. I call it the currency of our ecosystems. Our forests can't function without ants that perform all these really important functions. One of them is turning biomass into soil, right? Our forests can't function without insectivorous birds, which are, among other things, regulating populations of these insect pests that create a situation where, you know, all of our trees aren't getting completely defoliated by them. There's a million examples of things like that. And so biodiversity it's something that's actually essential not just to like the identity of our ecosystems, but to their function as well. So again, we can't talk about our forests without talking about history. And I know Maine is a little bit different, especially as you get into like the northern part of this county, I'm sure, much more defined by like logging than by the wholesale land clearing that we saw. But like in most of like southern Maine, Vermont, southern New England, what I tell people is that basically every forest you've ever been in was an agricultural field in the 1800s. I mean, in Vermont, we have less than 0.1% old growth. And old growth used to cover probably in excess of 90% or 95%, what we call old growth forests. And the rest were probably beaver wetlands. But it's this really important thing that we need to understand if we're going to understand where our forests are at today. And I'm going to do another reading about that. And I promise it's a little bit depressing, but it's not all going to be depressing. This book's about love, right? Is that what I want to do? Oh yeah. The 1800s marked a moment in what historian Frank Graham called the Age of Extermination. The wildlife of North America faded to the margins, their habitats destroyed, hunted for fur, food, and sport, predators exterminated out of a perverse sense of duty. In Vermont, caribou, moose, and elk, once the dominant herbivores on the landscape, disappeared by the late 1700s. Their predators, wolves and the eastern cougar, soon followed. Across the 18th and 19th century, many other species, including deer, beaver, fisher, marten, otter, bear, turkeys, and Canada geese, were extirpated from Vermont as they were from much of their range. or had populations so low that they were undetectable. By the beginning of the 20th century, wildlife populations across North America, from forest to prairie, had been changed forever. The herds of hundreds of millions of buffalo, the flocks of billions of passenger pigeons, the beaver dams that once filled Vermont's valleys at densities of 300 per square mile, the salmon rushing fin to fin, the bands of gangly wolves, all had become myths, stories of a lost past. Some wildlife species in Vermont has included beaver, fisher, sometimes known as fisher cat, turkey, and white-tailed deer, were reintroduced in Vermont in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Others, like otters, bears, and Canada geese, returned naturally. Others remain missing. Like the loss of a tree species, the ripples created by the loss of a wildlife species are unknowable. Each of this forest species is unique, the product of eons of evolution, an answer to the Earth's many enigmatic questions. Each is a member of a natural community, an intricate web of connections and relationships. Each is precious. As I kneel on the hillside, the age of extermination continues. Global animal populations have declined an average of 68% since 1970. That means there's 68% fewer animals on the planet now than there were 50 years ago. Some 680 species of vertebrate animals, along with perhaps 100,000 species of invertebrates, have gone extinct since the 1600s. 1 million others are threatened with extinction. So this thing happened where, Europeans descended on this place and, really transformed this landscape over an incredibly short period of time. Can you imagine what would happen if this landscape, predominantly forested, goes from being, let's say, 95% forested to, in Vermont, being less than 20% forested in the length of one human generation, 30 years. Remarkable. And how they even did that, honestly, is remarkable as well, with axes and handsaws and draft animals. Pretty amazing. And there was definitely forest exploitation for wood was also a big part of that, because when all these forests got cleared, all this agricultural land, fence posts became a kind of currency. I know they did in Maine, where people needed this wood for fence posts, and there wasn't any forests around. Railroads were running on wood. By 1870, they were using 7 million cords of wood a year. There's an amazing statistic. There's a great book. Okay. There's a great book called American Canopy by Eric Ruthko that sort of runs down all of these different historical moments in forests. And he has this one fact in it, which is that, again, by 1870, which is the railroads were using a ton of wood, they were burning wood to run the railroads, and they were also expanding railroads and they needed to use more ties and more tracks. People would cut wood for railroad ties. And just to replace railroad ties that were too rotten to use, not to build any more track, just to replace them, every year, they needed to clear cut an equivalent of 150,000 acres of forest. It's remarkable. And also at that time, in the 1800s, pre-advent of the wood stove, an average home might burn 40 cords of wood a year. And that's not including, boiling maple sap. That's not including smelting iron or making lime or any of the other things that we did with wood. Pretty amazing. So there were some reintroduction efforts. This is in Vermont, reintroducing beavers in the 1920s. Beavers are considered a keystone species. Do y'all know what that means? They're species that creates habitat for many others. And so when you lose the beaver, you lose an incredible array of habitats for all different manner of organisms, from aquatic plants to aquatic invertebrates, bugs, to, bigger birds like herons and fish and kingfishers and all kinds of different things, reptiles and amphibians. They also perform these really important functions to providing flood resilience, recharging aquifers, storing carbon, cleaning water. They do all of these really important things. There's a couple of good books about beavers that I can recommend to you if you want to hear about it. One of the things that's also remarkable about the beavers is that I mentioned it in that reading as an aside. We think that we had, in the 1600s, far more beavers than we would now believe to be possible. And that actually, that was the first species of animal that was really driven out of this land by Europeans, really before colonization started in this part of New England. You know why? Hats. Trapped for their pelts for hats. And actually, a lot of that trapping, it was done by, European trappers, but also a lot of it was done by indigenous trappers, because we would trade them all this really cool stuff, and they would, steal and all this neat stuff, and then go and trap us a beaver. They're like, this is amazing. I turn a beaver into like a gun, And it actually incited some regional conflicts between tribes. They trapped out all the beavers in one area, and they went to war with another tribe for their beaver trapping grounds. A series of wars in the 1600s called the Beaver Wars. But at any rate, this is an incredibly important creature to all kinds of different things, and luckily we have the foresight to reintroduce them. Yeah.
If you see a person with a ring and a beaver on it, do you know what that means?
No.
You're an MIT graduate.
Is that right? The smartest animal.
Nature's engineer.
That's right. Yeah, we call them ecosystem engineers.
Also the logo for the University of Maine at Farmington.
Well, yeah, because I know, Maine has these expansive beaver. It wouldn't surprise me if Maine would have more beavers. So a square mile, by the way, it's 640 acres. So a beaver dam 300 beaver dams per square mile, that's like a beaver dam every 2 acres in their valleys. And then, of course, we can no longer sustain that, right, because we built all these roads and houses in the valleys, but that's probably, a lot of these things that we now know as rivers with these nice, neat channels are probably much less like that, and much more of these really expansive complexes of beaver wetlands. The other species that's an interesting one that got reintroduced in Vermont is the fisher. Did that get reintroduced here? Does anyone know?
They're here.
It's here. Does anyone know why we reintroduced it into Vermont? Porcupines.
Yeah.
In Vermont, there was a porcupine bounty for like 50 years because they're the only known predator of the porcupine, and they're a weasel, fur bearer. They were also trapped out, and for 50 years, you would like kill a porcupine and cut off the ears and turn him into the town clerk, and the town clerk would issue you a bounty. Wild. Yeah, so if you want to have some fun with do you have town clerks here? If you want to have some fun with your town clerk, just bring them some bloody porcupine ears and see what they do. So all this stuff happened. So a lot of this land was cleared for agriculture, also really aggressively logged, and the result of that was we have forests that are really nothing like the forests that were here on this landscape for thousands of years. They're very young. So across most of New England, our forests are generally like 60 to 100 years old, which for a forest to develop into something that we might call an old growth forest, we're talking like 300 years minimum. They lack many of these elements of those old growth forests, the things we talked about, and I'm like, this is what healthy forests actually look like. So big trees, diversity, that multi-generationality, many different sizes and ages of trees, which, by the way, is caused by just trees dying and the forest regenerating again and again and again and again and again until there's no real clear generations in the forest. Excuse me. Complexity, dead wood on the ground, soil carbon, a lot of different things, and also landscapes that are these mosaics of forests of different ages and types and expressions. So just like our forests haven't had time to develop a lot of these really cool attributes we don't find in an old growth forest, our landscapes haven't had time to develop all of the diversity that we would have found in an old growth landscape. And there's some different forest composition as well, different tree species that are now more prominent or less prominent. In Vermont, the biggest one that I think of with this is American beech, which where I live, we have pre-settlement survey records, and they say that American beech was 60% of all the trees. And now it has a species, a non-native pathogen called beech bark disease, another one called beech leaf disease, and it's like 3% of the trees, and it behaves in a totally different way. So we've got all these legacies of the past, and then we need to recognize that we have all this stuff happening to forests right now, and that's happening to them in the future. So I like to use this word, rather than just talking about like climate change or these other things individually, I like to talk about this word, which is global change. Global change is climate change plus all that other stuff, the legacies of that past land management, non-native invasive pests, animals and pathogens, and plants, forest loss, forest conversion, forest fragmentation, pollution, global biodiversity loss, all this different stuff, because if we're going to take care of our forests, we can't just be thinking about one part of that. We need to be thinking about all that stuff and doing stuff that's going to take care of all that stuff. And so global change is a much better way of thinking about it. All of these things are happening to our forests right now, and all of them, if we don't do anything about it, are going to get worse. So this is my reminder to talk about, and you're looking at it right now. So here's the highway. Here's a 150-foot wide double power line corridor filled with invasive plants. Okay. And this is my land, Bear Island. So in 2017, I bought this piece of land that I came to name Bear Island. And there's a story that I talk about in the book. The first time I walked it and I said, this is the most degraded and unhealthy forest I've ever been to. And I remember I was like walking. I first drove up the road. The road was a ravine, essentially, been totally washed out. Went up to a log landing, which was just covered in trash, bags of trash, busted equipment, all this different stuff. And then walked up a skid trail that was 3-foot deep ruts, eroding straight up the mountain. And I was walking for like 45 minutes in the woods, and I was like, what's wrong? What's wrong here? And I realized that I hadn't seen a healthy tree. And what had happened is that loggers had been told by the previous landowner to cut every tree in the forest bigger than 10 inches in diameter, which is like a tree like that. And as a result, they had basically done like the reverse forest management that we want to do, which is that those smaller trees that they had left behind were the least healthy. Those biggest trees that they cut were the most healthy. And so they'd essentially done a practice that we call high grading, which is where you just cut the highest value trees and you leave all the lowest value trees behind. There's actually a pretty strong argument that that's actually more harmful than clear cutting all the trees, because if you clear cut all the trees, at least you can regenerate a new generation of trees that has a chance to be healthy, rather than, these trees, they filled in their canopy and we had a forest of 100% unhealthy trees. It was also, I had 30 acres of almost pure non-native invasive plants. It was a deer overpopulation browsing the forest understory. It was just awful. And I said, forget this place, I'm out of here. And then I started to think about it. And I came back. And when I came back the second time, I just started finding all this cool stuff. I started finding all these things that made me think that maybe there was hope for this place after all. And I also started to think about, if I'm not going to do it with the skills that I have and the experience that I have, who will? And so I ended up buying it for real cheap. I remember actually I had a conversation with my boss who sold forest land in real estate. And I was like, how do I do this? How do you buy a piece of forest land? And he kept on asking me questions about it. And he was like, well, is the access good? And I was like, nope. He was like, any development potential? I was like, nope. Like, could it be a sugar bush? No. Is the timber any good? No. It's just like one thing after another. I was like, nope. And he said, don't worry about hurting their feelings. Just offer them that. And now, when I first got there, I felt like it was almost like that land was a symbol of like everything that was wrong with the world, because it had like every problem that a forest could have. And I was like, yes, this is like the forest of the modern world, And not as bad as Bear Island, but I'm a forester. Every piece of land that I walk on is dealing with some degree of those same challenges. Every one of them is struggling with the land use of the past and those legacies that have just made these forests super young and simple. Every one of them is dealing with these non-native tree pests and pathogens. Every one of them is dealing with non-native invasive plants and deer overpopulation, all of these issues. And so I was like, this is the land that's the symbol of everything that's wrong. And now I see it as something else, which is a symbol of what's possible, and really like a symbol of hope. So it made me think about, sort of catalyze this idea in my mind of like, here we are. We have these ecosystems that we have that have, are imprinted with the legacies of the past in a way that there's nothing we can do about that, right? That are struggling with all these threats and stressors in the present, and that are moving into this future that for sure promises challenges like never before. And with Bear Island, it was just so simple, right? Like, here's this piece of land that I'm responsible for. And would it be a greater act of compassion and responsibility and stewardship for this piece of land to do nothing and to just let it continue to suffer, or to do everything in my power to make it healthy again? And since then, this isn't my skidder, but I actually have one just like it. Since then, I have taught myself to run an excavator, bought a skidder, and I cut down trees all the time. I kill deer, control invasive plants, do all of these incredibly bittersweet things that I think a lot of people would think could never be expressions of stewardship or compassion for a forest, and to me are the most radical things I've ever done. And to me, what makes them really special is the fact that, I actually love this forest. I care about it enough to do that stuff. And I love trees. And I love deer. And I don't want to kill them. But this is what this forest needs from me in this moment. That it's not going to be okay without my help. And it requires radical action to make it healthy again. I do also and I think it's really interesting that the loggers who did what they did to my forest used the same kind of skidder that I now use. So they use this tool in one way to degrade this ecosystem. I use the same tool, skidder, chainsaw, to help it heal. There is so much nuance in all of these things where it's it's really important that we understand that a lot of these things that we think of as tools that can only be used to harm ecosystems, some of them can be used as actually really powerful, profound, important tools to help them. And I believe that we also have a responsibility to help them. I started thinking about this from that book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who talks about when we own a piece of land, we think about we hold this bundle of rights. Here's all the rights that we have. We can log it, and we can mine it, and we can do this and that and the other thing. And why would we also not think that we have a bundle of responsibilities? That there may be some need for us to reciprocate some amount of care to that land. I just want to read this very quick reading. That's at the end of this chapter where I'm basically just cutting trees the whole time. I believe that our true nature is to be caretakers, stewards of this earth. I believe that the true nature of our power is not to degrade and to destroy, but to protect this living world and to protect each other. We already have the power to bring justice and mercy and tenderness and opportunity to all things. We already have the power to transform this Anthropocene into an epic of awakening, an epic of regeneration, an epic of abundance. We just need to choose to do so. As I descend the hill, I wonder what Bear Island will be when I'm an old man and my legs are no longer strong enough to carry me up the hill. In the dusk of my life, I wonder how many pieces of me will be embedded in this place forever, like stones in the soil. I hope that I will have used my power to help this forest rediscover itself, that in some small way I will have helped to build a better world. In these moments, my life feels sacred and precious, a gift given to me so that I may help heal this crooked world. In these moments, I feel like a keystone species, life spreading from me in every direction. I walk through the singing forest, dreaming of a living piece, a future written in green ink. So, this idea, it doesn't have to be also that we're just stemming the tide. I really have this idea that we ourselves can become a keystone species in this moment. We have the tools. This is what my next slide is going to say. We already have the tools. We already can do it. And, the transformations that I've seen in my land by using a skidder and an excavator and a chainsaw, tools that have been around for a long time, are profound. and objectively important. And so I think that this is important also for us to acknowledge that, like, we're not waiting for some new invention that's going to, like, make it possible for us to do what we need to do. The tools already exist. We can do it with existing tools and existing resources. We just have to decide that we will do it. And it doesn't have to be about, again, just like trying to make the world less worse. There's this cool thing where I started to think about it because we have these forests that are so young, you know, and they're really just at the beginning of their journey. And then over time, and if we do management in the right way, we can accelerate this process dramatically. We can make them more like those old growth forests, right? At the same time that we're doing things like harvesting local renewable resources, wood, at the same time that we're like providing habitat for elements of our biodiversity that might be in trouble. And when you start to think about it that way, you start to realize that as you're doing that, as these forests are changing, as you're maybe changing those forests, that you're actually developing a greater capacity for life in those systems. That you're creating habitat that is not just not less than it was before, but it's habitat that is way more complexity, more diversity, more abundance in those ecosystems. And I started to think about, you know, what an important way to think about this work broadly. That we have an opportunity not just to like not do a bad job, but to actually make this more. And for me, that's a really important message as we move forward. Is like it's about hope, and it's about the fact that we actually can do this. We just have to do it. And there is a longer reading that I want to do that's about that. From the last chapter. The storm clouds stamp their feet. They are corralled along the shifting path of the big river, thundering between the walls of the broad valley. The clouds move west, driven like cattle toward the mountains. As empty as it often feels, there is something beautiful about a life lived in the aftermath. Here in the junkyard of the Anthropocene, we hold the fate of this world, all of its ecosystems, all of its peoples in our hands. In this moment, we can allow this biosphere, our home, to sink further into dysfunction or disarray, or we can make the radical and bittersweet decisions necessary to choose a different path. Inside of this catalyzing moment, we have the opportunity to reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and our relationship to each other, to redefine what we are and what is precious to us. As empty as they often feel, there is something beautiful about a landscape of forests that are just a fraction of their true potential. The forests of our lives are still only at the beginning of their journeys. They may yet become diverse and complex, rich with legacies, ancient again. With our help, these forests may discover a capacity for life beyond imagining, an abundance that this world has not known for generations. I pick up another acorn, another product of thousands of years of adaptation and change, another precious thing chained to the legacies of the past and hurtling toward an uncertain future. Perhaps it is doomed. Perhaps it contains endless possibilities. Humidity cloaks the land, drawing tiny round beads of sweat from my skin. For a moment, the mountain is cast in golden light. It smells sharp and strong. As my fingers touch another acorn, a raindrop strikes the back of my hand, rolling between the small bones of my fingers. Suddenly, droplets are stippling the soil like falling stars, throwing up little clouds of dust. I have nowhere to be, and so I kneel, watching the water run around the stumps and the upturned leaves, drawing spider webs in the earth. Someday I will tell my children that the caves in the talus above are a womb, the origin of all the black bears on the mountain, and that the spring in the big bowl are the source of all of its waters. Someday I will walk these trails with my children and teach them to reimagine forests as communities of complexity and depth and expansiveness, communities that are fated to change, to celebrate both the miracle of life and the miracle of death. Someday I will kneel beside these stumps, a young forest blooming around me, and teach my children the imperfect truth of what it means to love a forest. Someday I will teach my children that this world is not ours to hold, but that we hold it anyway. That each of us is a steward for one brief and precious moment in time. In our short lives, we must learn to pair power and freedom with humility, to embody relationship and responsibility, even when it breaks our hearts. Someday I will teach my children that, despite everything, we are destined to thrive, that we are destined to live in a world that is beautiful. In the years to come, the traces of this moment will fade. This empty patch cut will become a diverse young forest, the stumps softening and mixing with those of the oaks cut decades ago. I will walk through this young forest and remember this autumn day when my hands were young. I will remember that each tall, perfect oak was once an acorn between my fingertips, that this forest is a child of responsibility, something that we could only have embodied together. No one but me will ever truly know the pieces of myself that I have left on this mountain, the labor of love that being the steward of this land has been. I will know, and that is enough. We owe too much to the future to be imprisoned by the past. As the storm passes over me, I'm grateful to be anything at all, grateful to be alive at a time when there is so much worth saving. I'm going to live in the world that will arise from this moment, the world built by people who are brave and humble and resilient, who make countless bittersweet compromises, who live their lives with the dream of a better world burning in their chests. I'm going to live in a world that will be created by people planting acorns in the rain. Sometimes this life feels like autumn, the exhausted end of a boundless summer. Today I choose to live in a world in which spring is just breaking, impossible and inevitable, a world that is just awakening, just beginning to discover what it truly is. I look toward the broken ridge of the mountain and feel a powerful nostalgia, not for the past, but for the future. High above the storm, the light is swelling, calling everything upward toward a world that is just beginning. What if? Right? It's weird. I feel like we're so inundated, I feel inundated by this information about everything that's going away, and everything that's ending. And I know that young people that I talk to, especially really young people, feel that way too, that they're just like born into this world of these like environmental catastrophes, and it's just like ubiquitous in their lives. And what if this moment right now could be a moment when it's the beginning of something better? And it can be. And this is the thing, but it can't be if we're not willing to do this stuff. That's going to be really hard and really bittersweet and confusing. That's going to allow us to actually get where we need to go. We're not going to do it if we're not willing to cut some trees, and if we're not willing to kill some deer, and if we're not willing to do all of these incredibly bittersweet things. That, to my eyes, are the biggest expressions of love that we can possibly offer. Anyway, it's 6:53. Do any of you have any questions for me about all this? I know it's a lot, and I put this like super heavy reading on you all. And, I'll tell you what. I would. Are you all? You want me to do one more reading, or do you want to just look at me, sell some books or something? You buy some books with me. One more. Okay. This is another word that I think about. So the chapters in the book are, if I can remember them, let me make sure I don't forget. I don't leave anybody out. Reimagining, responsibility, legacy, power, change, freedom, relationship, humility, resilience, beauty. Which are sort of like the themes that I like wrap the whole thing around. Legacy is an interesting one, because I think one of the things that we all need to get used to is just the fact that like we inherit all these legacies that we don't have any control over. And especially for like younger people, they're like, it's not fair. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And we can only be where we are. And we can only move forward from where we are. And if we get so lost being upset about that, we're never going to get anywhere new. And then the second part of that, legacy is also actually a biological term, but the second part of legacy from a human perspective is it's the legacy we leave for a future. You know, how do we leave a better legacy for future generations? How do we leave a world that is not always less than it was, you know, with every generation that passes, but is actually more? So in this legacy chapter, I rate it from third person. So I describe a person who is the man. That's me. And I talk about wolf trees. So a wolf tree is a tree that basically was growing by itself in the middle of the field. And I thought it would just be so interesting. I think about those trees, especially with this land clearing. You know, they were there when all this land clearing happened, some of them. And then they became this massive tree with like livestock grazing around them and grew this big wide open canopy. And then, you know, as those fields were abandoned, watched this forest rise like precipitously around them. And so I sort of wrote a chapter following a wolf tree through that process. So you're going to hear me refer to a wolf tree. On the edge of a clearing, a chipmunk cached an acorn in the rotting wood of a white pine stump. The next spring, the acorn sprouted, becoming a tiny seedling. A pair of delicate leaves announced the seedling's identity to the world. Red oak, the acorn tree. Somehow the little oak was overlooked by the deer as they waded through the meadow of hay-scented ferns on the edge of the log landing, overlooked by the loggers with their chainsaws. Somehow the little oak raised itself upward, growing a thin trunk and tiers of branches, each tipped in lobed leaves and clusters of ornate scaled buds. The man named the little oak the memory tree, and each time his trunk pulled into the clearing, he would measure it with his eyes like a doting father, his face full of hope. The man and the memory tree grew up together. Through long summer days, the man labored in the clearing in the woods above, working hard to leave a legacy that he could be proud of. In the heat of the day, the man would rest in his chair at the base of the memory tree, drinking cool water and dreaming of many things that might someday be. He dreamed of healing, of emergence and abundance, of unwinding the threads of legacy that gripped the forest on the mountain. He dreamed of people who would accept responsibility for the forest of their lives and who would do what was necessary, however bittersweet, to help them shine again. Against all odds, the memory tree grew into a world of promise and opportunity, a gift to the man's children, a gift to future generations. Slowly, the man's legacy took root, like an acorn planted in the earth. Across the world, the Khasi people of northern India built bridges from the bodies of fig trees, turning vines into living structures of purpose and beauty. They began building each bridge knowing that it would take generations to complete, knowing that they would never walk across it. They did it anyway. It was their legacy, a gift to their children, a gift to future generations, a gift to an unknown future. Behind us, the world is crumbling. Ahead of us is a roaring stream. What bridges will we build so that our children may cross the water? Thank you. So I got the book there, no pressure. If you want to buy it, you can, or we can. I'm going to hang out for a little bit so we can just chat and you can ask questions or anything like that too. And I'm just staying down at the Black Bear Motel or whatever.
Oh, the Bears Day?
The Bears Day.
It's karaoke night, right?
I went into the restaurant. I was like, I'm looking for the office of the motel, and the restaurant.
You found it.
You're here.